Let's consider now id, ego, and superego. I'm sure you have heard about them too. If you're students of psychology, you would know. If you're not, you may have still heard about them anyway, or read somewhere about it. There are three parts within the psychic apparatus, as defined by Sigmund Freud in his structural model of the psyche. They are theoretical constructs in the form of activities and interaction of the mental life. We name them as id, ego, and superego. Id, that's I-D, represents the set of uncoordinated instinctual trends. Ego represents the critical and realistic part, whereas superego plays the critical and moralizing role. Superego can stop you doing things your id may want you to do. Although they are described as something structural, but they remain still as the functions of the mind, not part of the brain, and certainly do not correspond with the somatic structures considered within neurosciences. This system by Freud was first discussed in the 1920s essay Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and 3 years later was formalized in his The Ego and the Id. It is more unorganized and contains basic and instinctive human drives. This component of personality is always present from birth. It is also the source of the body's needs, wants, wishes, and impulses, including sexual and aggressive ones. It operates according to the pleasure principle and seeks to avoid pain and unpleasure. But notice my words, unpleasure, not displeasure, by the increasing instinctive tension. Id remains unconscious. It remains within the dark and inaccessible parts of our personality we know very little about, despite our endless endeavors to uncover the secrets of our dreams and structure of neurotic symptoms. Most of them remain negative. Therefore, we may even classify it as being in contrast to ego. We may even call it chaos, if you like. It is energized from our instincts, without order or any organization, not creating a collective will, only striving to bring satisfaction of the instinctive needs of the individual. There is nothing in the id which can be compared with negation, and nothing which can correspond to the concepts of time. Even with the fetus, it remains just the same until birth, when the psychic apparatus begins, and it develops into a structured ego. When we are talking about psychic apparatus, we are not talking about what occultists speak of, but ego, id, and superego. In other words, it contains all the things inherited and laid down in the Constitution, right from the beginning. This is also why the instincts find a first physical and psychical expression in the id, in some forms unknown to us. The mind of a newborn child is id-ridden. It is a mess of instinctive drives and impulses. Remember, it always needs immediate satisfaction. There is no sense of responsibility. Id has no judgment of value. It has no morality, nor any good or evil. Perhaps we may even call it a great reservoir of libido. In other words, the instinctive drive to create. Along with life instincts come the death instincts. And it tries to please the id's drive as realistically as possible. But it has a task. It is to lead organic life back into the inanimate state. According to Freud, the ego attempts to mediate between id and reality, and it cloaks the unconscious commands of the id with its own preconscious relations or realizations to conceal the id's conflicts with reality. Ego is comprised of the organized part of personality, which includes perceptual, defensive, intellectual, cognitive functions. In other words, conscious awareness resides in the ego. However, not all of the ego remains conscious. I believe Freud originally used the word ego to signify a sense of self, but later revised it. It was now to signify a set of psychic functions like judgment, tolerating, reality testing, control, planning, defense, synthesis of information, intellectual functioning, and, of course, memory. Ego separates out what is real and helps us to organize our thoughts and make some sense of them, and to understand the world around us. We may even say that ego means what is called reason and common sense, in contrast to id. But at the same time, the ego is part of id, being modified by the external world. It also contains all our passions, all our emotions. It uses the borrowed forces and serves the external world, the superego and the id. It is mainly concerned with an individual's safety and well-being. It tries to bring balance between primitive drives and reality, at the same time satisfying the id and the superego. If it is driven by the id, it can be repulsed by reality, and now it starts struggling, and it can readily break out in anxiety. It needs to work hard to please all sides. Ego can be more loyal to id. It can gloss over the details of reality to reduce the possible conflicts and pretending to have a regard for reality. But superego is different. It always is on watch. It knows how to punish ego with feelings of anxiety and guilt, as well as inferiority complexes. Because of this, ego can utilize defense mechanisms, which are not direct or conscious. Ego defense mechanisms are usually used when id behavior conflicts with reality, or social morals, norms and taboos, or an individual's expectations as a result of the internalizing of those morals, norms, and their taboos. Freud identifies those defense mechanisms as denial, displacement, fantasy, compensation, rationalization. Now, Freud's daughter, Anna, made them even clearer. Undoing, suppression, dissatisfaction, idealization, identification, inversion, and substitution. Currently, the ego can translate to one's self-esteem, inflated sense of self-worth, conscious thinking self, in psychological sense, one's own self. Development of ego is considered as the development of multiple processes, cognitive functions, defenses, and interpersonal skills, or the early adolescence. Freud's concept of the superego is a combination of the ego ideal. We call this our conscience. According to Freud, the installation of superego can be described as a successful instance of identification with the parental agency. As the development is furthered, the superego takes on the influence of those who have stepped into the place of parents, including educators, teachers, and people chosen as ideal models, as with those Jehovah's Witnesses, for instance. The superego aims for perfection. It comprises the organized part of the personality and is not entirely unconscious. It includes an individual's ego ideals, even spiritual goals. The psychic agency or the conscious can be critical of his or her fantasies, feelings, and actions. Superego is a type of conscious which can punish misbehavior with feelings of guilt. Imagine being separated from one's partner and having an affair with another. Superego controls our senses of right, wrong, and guilt. In other words, it helps us fit into the society. According to Freud, superego is an internalizing of a father figure, as well as cultural regularities. It tends to be in opposition to the wishes to the id, when there are conflicting objectives towards ego. Now, the superego and the ego are the product of two factors: the state of helplessness of a child and the Oedipus complex. It forms during the dissolution of the Oedipus complex and is formed as an identification and internalization of the father figure after the little boy cannot successfully hold the mother as a love object out of fear of castration. This concept is subject to criticism for its preconceived sexism. According to his considerations, women do not identify with the father. Their superego cannot be inexorable, impersonal, independent of its emotional origins, as it is required to be in men. They are often influenced in their judgments by feelings of affection or the opposites. Freud also claimed that the majority of men are far behind the masculine ideal, and that as a result of their bisexual disposition and cross-inheritance, all human individuals combine in themselves both masculine and feminine characteristics. Thank you for sharing this part of our conversation. We shall meet soon again. I am Suren.